Hello and welcome to the Thematic Edge podcast. I'm Marvin Barth, and we have a very special guest this week. We have El Pollo Verde. Doomberg is with us, with us being my good friend and colleague, Mark Farrington. Doomberg, welcome to the program.
Marvin, what an intro, Mark. Great to meet you. Great to be here with both of you. Looking forward to a fantastic discussion. And before we dive in, I want to congratulate you, Marvin, on the success of your Substack. It's been fun to watch.
Okay, well, thank you. And actually, while we're on that topic, that one of the things I did want to say is that one thing that perhaps people don't know about you is that you are and your team are one of the nicest sets of individuals I've ever come across. You've been incredibly helpful. I know not only to me, but to many others on Substack. By the way, this is not an encouragement for everyone to solicit you for help. You will find us, as I have found out. But you are incredibly generous with your time, and I just want to personally thank you for that.
Well, it's very nice of you to say. I do have precious little of it these days, as you can imagine, given the news flow, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the current news flow. Before we do that, though, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark to ask some of these questions, but I just do want to remind everyone that everything we talk about here is for informational purposes only, that this is not investment advice from any one of the three of us, and that you need to do your own homework here. So with that in mind, Mark, why don't you take it away for the first part here?
Okay, sure. Like Marvin, I enjoyed reading your piece very much this week on the supply side issues as a result of the war in the Persian Gulf, and also shared your surprise at how well the market has behaved actually. I made a little comment back to you, so you can probably guess where I'm coming from with this. It seems like the market got caught anyway at one of the better moments in recent history, in the sense that strategic reserves were extremely high around most of the world, perhaps the US excluded, and floating storage and various other types of excess supply was around, that it felt like that's what's holding the market back in the short term. But there's also this talk about the alternatives, the pipelines being reactivated, Kirkuk in Iraq to Turkey, and across Saudi Arabia to the Red Sea, and UAE's a little short pipeline out to the Gulf of Oman. Is there enough? Obviously, it can't replace, what passes through the strait, but is there enough to keep prices under control long enough for this conflict to settle down, and maybe we don't have a full blowout in price?
So, great question. And we should probably say when we're recording this because the news might envelop us here. We're recording this on Tuesday, shortly after noon Eastern Standard Time. And the reason I point that out is because this morning, I think an incredibly foolish thing occurred, which is Israel, apparently with the backing of the US military, bombed the South Pars gas field,
Yeah.
which is an enormous escalation and invites significant retribution, which Iran has vowed to do. And already we're seeing reports of missiles and drones going into Saudi Arabia. And one wonders about the future of Qatar Energy's LNG export facility, which shares the same gas field, aforementioned gas field with Iran. And so, in a world where most of the oil and gas producing assets in the Middle East are destroyed, much of what my answer is going to be will be quaint slash irrelevant. But in a world where some form of sanity prevails, the war did come at about as good a time as any for the hydrocarbon complex. Even the fact that the U.S. strategic petroleum reserves are diminished compared to what Biden inherited doesn't really matter because the U.S. is a net energy
Right.
exporter of significant consequence.
Mhm.
Um, Amongst the excess capacity that is now suddenly valuable includes, you know, hundreds of millions of barrels, if you believe certain sources, of sanctioned oil sitting on the sideline, both from Russia and Iran and Venezuela. All, the niceties of sanctions are going to go by the wayside as the mad scramble for molecules continues. And then there is this leakage that you're talking about, the circumvention of the Strait of Hormuz. I think Javier Blas of Bloomberg has done a good job reporting that. He's out with a piece this morning updating it. Looks like Saudi Arabia has been able to get about half of its oil exports to market via other means. We wrote a piece last June after the 12-day war called, or maybe just before it, I forget, called Straight Shooting, where we mentioned that closing the Strait of Hormuz would be a one-time trick. And we're working on a doom zoom for March, of course, who isn't working on such topics these days, but the subject or the title is After Hormuz, Punctuated Equilibrium in the Energy Markets. What comes after this affair is interesting, and we don't want to be too early on it, but the world has allowed itself to be held victim to logistics. And historically, um, the antidote to that is an overinvestment in logistics when the shots stop firing. And we're about to see the mother of all midstream plays as there is a mad scramble to diversify the logistics to and from the Middle East. A giant pipeline from Saudi Arabia to Oman would seem to be in order, not just east-west, but north-south.
Yeah.
Amongst other possibilities, I think you're going to see proposals that the Suez Canal get expanded to fit VLCCs, for example. And another huge risk on the board, which should be articulated now, that makes most of this thought about why isn't oil even higher than it is moot, would be if the Houthis get into the game and shut down passage through the Red Sea,
Yeah.
which if they did, there goes much of Saudi Arabia's diversion. Um, there's other forms of leakage, black market barrels. There's a rail connection between Iran and China, but that nobody's talking about these days. Um, I would get long those who lay rail tracks in the Middle East once the shooting stops. I mean, um, it's going to be an all of the above mad scramble um, to close the barn door, I guess, is one way to say it. But you know, and so we wrote a piece called "Drilling Laterally," where we pondered, like, what if the market is right? What if oil doesn't need to go much higher than $100 a barrel for this to take care of itself? And again, in a world where nothing is destroyed and some semblance of sanity takes over, which seems to be in shockingly low supply at the moment. $100 a barrel probably clears the market. Well, it's obviously clearing the market today. But again, with the Houthis out there and with this escalation, this stupid escalation that we saw this morning, I do think you're going to see um, potentially substantially higher oil prices from here. Last thing I would say, and we made this point in drilling laterally, there's a lot of hyperventilating on Twitter. It's amazing how times like this expose certain people who you think used to have something interesting to say. Um, this talk of paper barrels and all of this nonsense. I mean, get real. Yes, there's a reason why oil is $150 in Dubai and only $96 in Oklahoma. There's a war in one of those two places. And then the second thing I would say is oil might print somewhere at $200 or $250 a barrel, but it can't stay there
Yeah.
because even if you lose the Middle East, there isn't 85 million barrels a day of demand for oil at $200 a barrel. There just isn't. Um, People will drive less. The EU might stop burning it to make electricity. Um, there will be a demand response,
Hmm.
and people will carpool. even odd license plates, all the things we saw, none of it good, none of it accretive to global economic growth. But oil can't stay at $200 a barrel,
Right.
even if it prints there. So that a bit of a long answer, but that's our view as of March 18th, I guess it is.
That's fantastic. I'll pass you back to Marvin, but I just want to clarify, since I didn't have a chance to look into it this morning, is there any chance that that strike, upstream on the Iranian facility is a false flag? It's guaranteed that it was Israel, because I agree, it makes absolutely no sense, and I can't believe the US would have
I
sanctioned
mean,
that.
the latest report I've seen is that the U.S. participated in it and is openly admitting it. And it's as a warning to Iran that they have to open the Strait of Hormuz, which is a catastrophic Look, I need to
Yeah,
take a pause. I need to take a pause here 1 second. I need to say two things. When this war broke out, we made two commitments internally. One, we would not indulge in hyperbole in the chase for eyeballs,
yeah,
because this would be an easy time to do it. And two, we would refrain from critiquing the president and U.S. strategy beyond what was appropriate, because we live in the U.S. and there are servicemen and women in uniform overseas in harm's way, and our ethics dictate that there'll be plenty of time to criticize the president and the strategy that led us here when this is done. Having said that, this attack this morning is so out of bounds and so stupid that it's warranted, in our view, to critique
yeah.
it now. So with those two sort of PSAs out of the way, turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Marvin?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Mark and I had wanted to ask you about, and we discussed beforehand, you actually touched upon, and so I'd like to just ask you if you might expand upon that before we come back to the sort of issue of, nearer term disruptions and things like that, which is this point about the long run ramifications of this. And I'm wondering how that. So I guess my first question is, who has the best potential to diversify distribution among the players in the Gulf? Was it, Iran? Is it various GCC members? In terms of, as you say, you could do a pipeline through Oman as well as to the Red Sea. You could widen the Suez Canal. You could increase pipelines up through Jordan, and given the increasing cooperation between Israel and the Saudis, through Israel. Whereas Iran, it seems like it's either rail, or if they can ever get it, pipelines, but that goes through a lot of questionable states, or it has to come on the south shore of Iran, just outside the Strait of Hormuz. But that seems pretty open to embargo as well. So, what are who's in the best position here for the long run, and who's most vulnerable to people switching away and deciding, look, we're going to reduce our dependencies, and so there's a loss of market share for these guys.
Well, the demand for oil is infinite at the right price, and so market share is not super relevant in our view. So we've been contemplating after Hormuz, right? Punctuated equilibrium in the energy markets is a subtitle, and I'll give away the tentative conclusion is that we think that the US's role as the dominant military in the Middle East is coming to an end, and China's going to take over one way or the other, either from the ashes or through participating in a negotiated settlement that resolves this. But the Gulf states have U.S. military bases on them because they believed this would bring them protection, and instead it brought them attack. And a core thesis of our upcoming presentation, which again, we tend to make some counterintuitive calls, is that the entirety of U.S. foreign policy since the 1970s has been predicated on the false belief that the U.S. was running out of oil. This Hubbard's Peak nonsense, which unfortunately coincided with a temporary decrease in U.S. oil production in the early 1970s, and the totally not coincidental rise of the petrodollar and the agreements with the Saudis and so on that followed. So basically, every war in the Middle East can be traced back to the fear amongst the foreign policy establishment in Washington that the U.S. was running out of oil and needed to go abroad to find it.
Mm.
Well, the shale revolution changed that. It changed all aspects of the energy markets except the foreign policy establishments in Washington, D.C.'s view that it needs to go abroad and find it. And this war will be a clarifying moment for that, in our view. There's one major superpower, and they are a superpower, which is China, that is, in fact, short hydrocarbons and needs to go abroad to find it. And when you look at the map, and we have a map in this presentation, very simple map, anybody can make it. Go download the wonderful free statistical review of world energy and just put oil production and oil consumption by region as they define it, North America, Central and South America, Europe, CIS, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa. And you could see where the giant red boxes are, Europe and Asia Pacific, and where the giant green box is, the Middle East. And China needs the Middle East more than the US needs the Middle East, and they will pay what is required to get the Middle East. And if anybody could rapidly build midstream and pipelines and ports, it's China. And that's what's coming. And the US doesn't need to be in the Middle East. It is a net energy exporter. It is the world's largest producer of oil by a wide margin. It is the world's largest producer of natural gas by an extraordinarily wide margin. It has spooled up the largest natural gas export capacity the world has ever seen in a decade. The one thing the US can still build is domestic energy production, exploration, and exports. And in the words of a famous Canadian politician, there's plenty to eat at home. And I just think this is where it's headed. That's where the thermodynamics says it's going. And one of the things we do around here is we look at what the physics says, because often you can get lost in the propaganda. So the answer to your question is all of the above in the Middle East, but that doesn't really matter. What matters most is who's going to run it. And given the current military dynamics, I know it's probably not polite to say it, given where I'm sitting, but I don't know how we end up in a world where China doesn't run it.
Mm-hmm. So, on that, you expressed how much the U.S. has these energy advantages. And yes, the U.S. is a net energy exporter, but there's an important adjective in that phrase, net.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I'd be curious to know more about is what are obviously in the long run, I mean, that's actually a fantastic point about the US building the LNG infrastructure in a decade. That's just staggering. But in the next year, where is the US vulnerable given that it does import a lot of products, given that it does import various grades of crude for its refining? Where are the vulnerabilities that the US is actually going to care about in the near term? And if you wouldn't mind extending that beyond petroleum, because I seem to recall that you have a background in petrochemicals more broadly, and some of the big issues that people have been focused on have been the interruption of urea and other fertilizer components, which are obviously critical to the U.S., and helium, which is critical to a lot of industrialized processes. Where are the acute vulnerabilities for the US right now in this if the Strait of Hormuz stays shut for a long time?
My quick answer is there are none. Um, if the US turtles in, and which I suspect Trump will do, and we're already seeing that. Here's why. So, yes, the US is a quote net energy exporter, which implies flows both ways, which do exist. What are the flows inward? The flows inward are refined products to the East Coast and to California. That's because they have unwisely I'll stop using the word stupid for the rest of this podcast. They have unwisely shut down their refining capacity, and they aren't really connected by pipeline to the Gulf Coast. And because of the Jones Act, you can't load a tanker in Houston and float it up to New York and unload it in New York. Well, what happened this morning is that the president signed a 60-day waiver of the Jones Act, as we predicted. So that's going to free that up. The other thing that comes in is heavy oils, because the shale revolution produced a far lighter grade than the U.S. refinery complex was built to handle. 2 points there. Venezuela sure does look prescient now, and Trump referring to Venezuela as the future 51st state replacing Canada. Perhaps Canada will be 52nd, I suppose. And on top of that, is it easier to build a pipeline through Oman, or to deepen the Suez Canal, or to retrofit your refining complex to handle lighter grades of crude? Seems like the second one is a relatively straightforward thing to do. It's just a matter of utilization, really. And if you build a big hydro treater, you kind of want to use it. But ultimately, those are relatively minor problems to solve. And then, helium, there's a lot of it in Canada. If you if you make Fortress North America and rope in Venezuela and Guyana while you're at it, and pave a bridge to Argentina, there's a reason why we wrote The New World's Oil all the way back in December of 2023. There's 10 million barrels of incremental supply waiting to be developed in the Western Hemisphere when you go from, the tip of Argentina to the Arctic. And so this is what the U.S. is going to get busy doing. But if you draw a circle, and we said this on a post early on Substack Notes, draw a circle around Canada and the U.S., what is allowed to be exported from that circle will soon change. And be it fertilizer, foodstuffs, oil, gas. Look, Europe is like, they're just totally dead. If Trump wanted to lower natural gas prices in the U.S. even further to make, I don't know, making fertilizer cheaper, all he has to do is limit LNG exports, and natural gas will be free in the U.S. It's already minus $4 a million BTU in the Permian this morning spot, and it's $3 a million BTU at Henry Hub, which is $18 a barrel of oil.
Yeah.
The U.S. is swimming in cheap hydrocarbons. It's almost like they planned it. And so here we are. But yeah, I mean, there will be shortages. There will be issues. I think the global financial system is going to be very, very strained here soon. If we're going to do a reset, you want to do it flush with hydrocarbons, not short them, I suppose. But broadly speaking, at least counting up the molecules, that India is running out of LPG is not really a big problem for the U.S. That Europe is going to pay 3 or 4 times what it was hoping to pay for natural gas to refill its coffers ahead of next winter is not really a problem for U.S. consumers, because we don't know what to do with the gas that we have already. And last point, $100 oil is extremely bearish for natural gas in the U.S., which few people understand, because with the shale revolution came the co-production revolution, which is that oil and gas and natural gas liquids are all co-produced together in the same well, depending on the well, but the ratios depend on the wells. And at $100 oil, if it's drill, baby, drill, it's get rid of the gas, which again is why gas is free in Western Canada, and it's free in the Permian, and it's practically free in Henry Hub, and it's, so there you go. I mean, anybody who's been in industry, and as you referenced, I spent a fair bit of time in the petrochemical space. Anybody who's competed against a co-producer knows how much it sucks. So if you're in the A business and there's a separate B business, and a co-producer makes both A and B at the same time, well, they're always putting one of the two industries in the hurt locker, because if A's price goes up, they give away B, make more A, and vice versa. And in this analysis, oil is A and natural gas is B, and the price of A just skyrocketed. That's not very bullish for B. It's bullish for supply of B, because it'll be given away. Great for AI data centers, assuming that they could get somebody to pay to build them, now that the Gulf state sovereign wealth funds are probably going to be otherwise uninterested.
So I mean, there's so many different directions to follow up from that. You know, one is you made this point, and we've decided not to use the word stupid in this for the rest of this podcast or to call anyone stupid. But let's refer perhaps to the short-sighted policies of Europe again and again and again and again. And to your point that um, there is not a problem for the US if everybody else can't get LNG, but all of a sudden the US is going to have an incentive to produce even more LNG than it did before at already very cheap prices. Most of that LNG export capacity, as I understand it, is mostly on the East Coast, so facing Europe. But given the recent developments in terms of, the Trump administration, some would say asking for help. I don't really think that's the way it was put. Um,
Sorry.
but let's just say it was a request, and look at Japan's response versus Europe's response. Who's going to get those export exemptions if the US puts them up? Can you speak to that,
Sure.
or am I wrong to even think about that?
I can't, for the life of me, cannot understand Europe's strategy, even now. So let's just walk through the numbers, because this is something that we've been pondering. Of course, we could make a living flogging Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, how fun would that be? But uh, only to be outdone by Kaya Kallas. But let's just look at the physics again. Let's go back to the physics. So in 2024, according to the Statistical Review of World Energy, Europe consumed 37 exajoules of hydrocarbons and produced 5. In a free-for-all of who can turtle fastest, who's going to be left without a chair when the music stops? Okay, let's drill down further, pardon the pun, and look at oil. Now, the previous numbers I gave you were for the European Union. Let's just go for the European continent now. So inclusive of Ukraine, Norway, and Great Britain. By the way, those last two are pretty important to include in this number because they produce most of what I'm about to say. Europe as a continent, as the Statistical Review of World Energy defines it, consumed 14 million barrels of oil in 24 and produced 3, or roughly the entire bogey of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And yet, they're bemoaning Besant loosening Russian sanctions. Like, hello, the time for such niceties. Like, it's like the Titanic is sinking, and they don't like the color of the tablecloths.
I'm sorry, some color commentary here. I mean, after you've done 19 sanctions,
Yeah.
I mean, this is the most important thing in the world. Nothing else really matters at this point, Doomberg.
I mean, talk about the definition of insanity. Forget stupid. Let's go one up. And it's insane. And by the way, like, Iran promised retribution, right? You attack us, you will get escalation in the same way. Well, what was attacked this morning? The South Pars gas field. Who did they share that gas field with? Qatar. Does Qatar still have a U.S. military base on it? Sure does. Are U.S. Oil and gas companies involved in the Qatari LNG trade? Sure are. What happens if Iran takes out Qatar Energy's LNG export facility? It's right there. Roslafen. We said in the piece War Dashboard that we wrote, 48 hours after the war broke out, that you should set a Google alert for Roslafen. In a world where 20% of LNG capacity goes offline, who's hurt the worst? It's Europe. And who right now is trying to rid itself of Russian LNG from Yamal? It's Europe. And who's twisting the knife now? Putin. Okay, you're trying to shut us out in 2027. I see you're 27 and I raise you at 26. See you in court. We're breaking these contracts. I mean, we wrote a piece called 90% of the law. Possession is about to be 90% of the law. It always is, of course. A contract is only as good as you're willing to sue to enforce it, and a judgment is only as good as you're able to collect on it. And by the time you do, you're going to have a really tough winter in 2027. So Europe ends this winter with dangerously low natural gas supplies in storage.
Yeah.
And this is what they're worried about. The hysteresis of the molecular origination. You ought to be worried about the storage levels in your tanks. Forget about where the molecules come from. And yet, Brussels is so tone deaf and so illiterate of physics that they are, quote, outraged that Besant had the audacity to go hand in hand to Putin, which is what he did. And they're lucky that Putin is obliging, although he is, we note with interest, charging a premium for his oil to India these days. And I'm sure the Indians are more than glad to pay that premium. So anyway, it is fascinating to see. One wonders how terrible it has to get for either Brussels to be shocked into reality or the good people of Europe to revolt. Because this level of insanity is truly unparalleled.
I couldn't agree more. Mark, you had some questions about, the sort of long-term diversification issues from a geostrategic perspective, and clearly Europe, I think, has been answered.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That was depressing and yet absolutely needed to be said. So well done. Thanks for that, Doomberg. Yeah, I guess that when I saw the breaking news of the missile strikes beginning, the first thought that came to mind is we're going to get another lesson in dependency. We had 2022 lesson with energy to Russia. Then we had the critical minerals lesson from China in October last year. And now we're about to have another one, which is just simply related to a geographic choke point. So how people respond to this particular dependency will be both accumulative from the past two painful lessons and also different because it's geographically driven. So I'm thinking dependency reduction not only on the geographic location, but also on all the different components that you and Marvin were just discussing in terms of petroleum products and refining capacity. It just feels to me like the conclusion from this third round of dependency lesson is that not only do you have to onshore, the raw commodities and the various sort of refining production, but you really need to produce a certain percentage of the products and comprehensively cover, your entire energy complex. So I just wonder if you think that initiative, really kicks into gear across a number of countries around the world, including China, as you pointed out, and then that somehow keeps the back end of oil prices under control because it really is viewed as the short-term shock that's going to deliver actually structural impairment to long-term demand.
Well, I think the opposite. So
Oh,
I think, look, in 2025 or 2026 US dollars, oil will print $25 a barrel before you know it. In the words of Nassim Taleb, I've never seen a glut followed by a shortage, but I've never seen a shortage not followed by a glut.
right.
And we will see a huge supply response. What falls by the wayside? So one of the sort of one-dimensional responses that we've seen is, oh, this is very bullish for solar and wind and batteries. We think quite the opposite. The fanciful pursuit of such intermittent, incomplete energy sources is part of the issue that has caused the countries that have pursued those those technologies to be in the hurt locker. I think of New Zealand and Australia, for example, who are in a devastatingly bad situation, having let most of their refining capacity wither away. They're literal islands. They have practically nothing in the form of inventory. We're writing a piece on Australia probably next week, assuming the headlines don't overwhelm us. Same with Europe that we just discussed. Let's not kid ourselves. The belief in wind and solar and batteries as some sort of panacea is an input into the flippant nature with which they have allowed their hydrocarbon policies to dissolve into farcical. And so, as we said, as I said on a prior podcast appearance, when was the last time the G7 had an emergency meeting because of the shortage of solar panels? It's not happened. So what's going to happen is all of the, everything that you thought you've learned in the last 40 years is about to be reversed, and that is, it extends well beyond the oil markets, onshoring, offshoring, all of that stuff. So broadly speaking, at the highest level, Wall Street in the West has rewarded efficiency, even if robustness is sacrificed. And that's no longer going to be tolerated. So the two of the things that Wall Street does a poor job of pricing are environmental degradation and national security risk. And China exploited both. We wrote a piece almost 3 years ago now called Geopolitical Warfare, where we pointed out how China was more than willing to debase its environment in order to corner and monopolize various materials that it wanted to for geopolitical reasons, including rare earths and other metals and materials that are in short supply today. All that's going to end, which means efficiency is going to be reduced and robustness is going to be valued. So Australia is going to start drilling again. New Zealand is going to start drilling again. They're going to have, instead of 19 days of supply, they'll have 100 days of supply. Like China has 300 days of supply or 500 days of supply, depending how big China's bogey is. So that's coming in a big way. The answer won't be let's move away from oil and gas. Let's make oil and gas far more robust than we have allowed ourselves to experience it in this emergency. The second thing that I want to put out there that is coming is whenever you see these blow-off tops in oil, inevitably a world-changing technology presents itself on the other end of it. And that's coming here. We have some thoughts as to what those might be. But in 2007, 2008, $147 a barrel intraday price, Twilight in the Desert is a bestseller, and everyone on Wall Street is a peak oil theorist. And I was in the industry at the time, and around then, or maybe a few years after, I forget now, but Freeport LNG was meant to be an import terminal. I'm old enough to remember that. It is now an export terminal. It was retrofitted rather hastily. Why? Because what presented after the global financial crisis was shale. And there will be another shale. Either China will crack its shale, or ultra deep drilling will prove Thomas Gold right, and the abiotic theory of oil will suddenly become mainstream, or, as we've written about in a few speculative pieces, natural hydrogen might be something that is suddenly commercially viable, where you literally drill and tap pre-existing stores of hydrogen underground, bring them to the surface, and fire them away in your internal combustion engine and only produce water outside of the tailpipe. A win-win for those who care about climate, as it were. I'm sure they'll figure out something to complain about hydrogen leakage or something at some point, but I digress. There is going to be a game-changing technology that makes this whole experience something that is in the rearview mirror permanently when this is done. That's a pretty safe bet.
Well, let's hope that nobody has to end up found floating in a hot tub to make that happen. Um, uh, No, nobody got that. No, that was
Yeah, yeah.
It's over my head. I'm sorry.
no,
Yeah.
sorry. I thought you brought up the what was the book?
Oh,
Peak
Twilight
Oil.
in the Desert? Yeah.
Yeah, Twilight in the Desert. The author, what was his name?
Simmons?
Yeah, Simmons. He was found floating
Oh,
face down in a hot
I,
tub
wa- I,
time
I
the
was
shale revolution took off. Uh,
I was unaware of that. I guess it beats a buzzsaw.
sorry,
Nice, cheerful
my
anecdote.
terrible sense of humor over here. Um, very morbid as well. But
I'm saying, we would call that a deep cut, Marvin. That was a deep cut.
yes, so I, you know, let me push you on that one because I think what Mark was trying to get on that is not that oil would people would move away from oil. I think the point is, and it actually goes to something you've written about, right? That and you were one of the first people I saw to make this point in that particular space. There are lots of spaces that, as you highlighted, China was very good at going after and making sure that it had the critical inputs to the production of a lot of critical products across the spectrum of different products you would need that we consider essential to Western life or modern life. Um, but one of those was refined products. So despite the fact that they're a net importer, they're a tremendous exporter of product. And you pointed out Australia, New Zealand, are critically short of refining capacity. So, to what extent do you see a lot of those sort of advantages that China has built up over the last 30 years and sort of intermediate inputs to the sort of broad life that people live being undermined because people are going to see, wow, actually, we have these vulnerabilities en masse. Um, and who are the countries? Obviously, Europe is out to lunch. Who are the countries we should be watching
Yeah.
for this?
So let me build on your point before I answer your question. And if I don't answer your question, remind me. What does China do? If you look at geopolitical warfare, which was one of several pieces of that genre that we've written over the years, when China is short something that it deems critical, this is a fear-driven policy. It is afraid it will be cut off of that thing. And so it finds the earliest phase, the earliest stage in the supply chain that it can dominate with money, where it doesn't need a natural endowment to dominate. And so if you look at solar panels, it wanted to dominate solar panels. I was in the solar industry when it decided to do that. Yes, the US still produces, solar grade polysilicon, but it needs to be sent to China to be, transformed into ignits and sliced into wafers and mounted on cells. So what did China do in the oil markets? Well, it doesn't have a lot of oil, but let's build a bunch of refiners. And it has 16, 17 million barrels a day of refining capacity. And if China's short on crude, its neighbors are going to be the one that feels the pain first. Because as it did in the first week of this crisis, it stopped exporting diesel and jet fuel and gasoline on the first sign of a shortage. Well, it's done that across many, many, many industries. Magnesium, graphene, pick your favorite, rare earths. All of these, within 5 years, you won't be able to give away.
Yeah.
The supply response, what's going to happen is people are going to overcorrect.
Yeah.
Oh, we have overpriced the sanctity of our private gardens, as Europeans would say. We're not going to drill for oil and gas in Europe. It's a great, beautiful garden. Why do we want to spoil our garden? Gee, there used to be a giant magnesium plant in Freeport, Texas. Maybe it was a bad idea shutting that down. Oh, processing rare earths is degradation, to the environment. Okay, well, let's put a price on that. we're seeing it already with the U.S. military putting floor pricing into its equity investments into these mines. There will be an overcorrection. All shortages lead to gluts. And these cards that China is playing can only be played once, much like the Strait of Hormuz is a card that can only be played once, and there will be an avalanche of midstream investments. And so um, we could talk about Korea, but let's put a pin in Korea because we're actually maybe publishing on Korea here in a second. But the Japans, the Australias, the New Zealands, the Britons, the European Unions, they're going to have to get very serious very quickly. And by the way, these aren't like magic technologies. People know how to refine oil, know how to smelt aluminum. Like it's not like the West has forgotten how to do this. As we like to say, nothing a fine can't cure. Just throw money at the problem and it will be solved, and much money will be thrown at this problem. But 5 years from now, these cards will be dulled in the knife that China currently has will be severely dulled to the point of not really all that powerful, because that has to be what happens. I mean, the alternative is it's just sort of Pascal's wager. It's like betting against the existence of God. So that's coming. Can I talk about Korea for a bit? Because it's tangential to this question.
I would love you to, because I think it's related to the question I asked you about Japan as well. And would you mind touching on Japan?
Sure,
And I will remind you that Mark spent many years in Japan and is an expert all things Japan. So he'll probably have a thing or two to say there. But I'm really interested in that contrast
sure.
between Europe and, frankly, what I would call the East Asian American alliance. And that dichotomy or that difference that's developing here is just staggering.
Yeah, so I would say this. In a world where the US runs the Western Hemisphere and Russia and China split, Asia, including what the Iranians call East Asia, which is the Middle East, there's a couple of outlier countries. On the Asian side, the wrong side, are Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And in the Western Hemisphere is Brazil, must be said. The B in BRICS being here alongside, a communist country 30, 40 miles from Florida. Those two things, Cuba and Brazil, seem to be out of place over here. We could come to those later. Um, we became interested in Korea last year. We wrote a piece. Occasionally, we like to write a piece that's way out there, um, just because it's, renewables bad, dance monkey, some guy shooting a gun at me. Say the words, renewables bad. So we occasionally like to write about something different. And we wrote a seemingly out of nowhere piece last July, I think. Didn't really have much in the way of engagement. Look, you're in this business, when a piece lands. We call them a heater. This wasn't a heater of a piece, but it was one that we wrote that we enjoyed writing just because it was out there. It was called Soulmates. And the social preview to the piece was the physics of Korean reunification. And if you just ignore all the headlines and all of the challenges and, oh, Kim Jong-un is crazy and, it's a hermit kingdom and all of this jazz, if you just take a step back and you look at the physics of the Korean Peninsula, here's what you find. Um, Enormous synergy. So South Korea, um, world-beating nuclear technology for civilian energy, right? So, deeply dependent on imports for hydrocarbons, third largest importer of LNG, major importer of coal, um, has a good refinery network, but no crude. What do you have in North Korea? You have a desperate need for a modern civilian electricity grid, which Korean engineers could easily build. You have a huge supply of coal, kind of stranded there because nobody does business with North Korea, but that's how they make their electricity. And a few miles on the other side of their very small border with Russia sits a large natural gas pipeline that ends right there, that Vladimir Putin has long, I think, hoped would be extended into North Korea. And then once you're into North Korea, it's pretty easy to extend it down to South Korea. And in fact, the Russians could easily supply 100% of both Koreans' natural gas demand and probably pretty easily build a crude pipeline alongside it, right of way and all of that stuff. Um, and so all of a sudden, in China's sphere, which would like stability in the Korean Peninsula, um, the prospect of Korean unification makes an awful lot of sense from a physics perspective. And we're putting up, well, I've written, and it is currently in edit, a follow-up piece to that one, pointing out how this crisis would seem to bring that prospect forward even more. Not coincidentally, in the face of Qatar Energy's force majeure, you have the South Koreans suddenly talking about reunification again, and Kim Jong-il firing off missiles, perhaps as a preemptive negotiation strategy. And then you see the U.S. pulling the THAAD missiles out of Korea, at least parts of them, because Iran has surprised to the upside in its ability to target the THAAD systems that are in the Middle East, almost certainly with the help of the Chinese and the Russians. Shock, I know, that the Russians would help Iran after the U.S. has been giving Ukraine targeting coordinates inside of Russia for 4 years. In a world where the U.S. is taking away missile systems out of Korea, which, by the way, you probably remember were extraordinarily controversial when they went in 2017 and led to a huge disruption in the South Korean Chinese commercial trade. They've since achieved a sort of a détente. Korea hasn't been a democracy. South Korea has not been a democracy for all that long either. So in our view, in the post-Hormuz world, the reunification of Korea is far more likely than people think. Now, again, unlikely to be a piece that lands in the middle of all of this noise, and so we might not publish it, but that's what we think on Korea. Now, as to Japan, I defer to Mark. I would say Japan, unlike some of the other island nations, Taiwan, I would loop into this, which we haven't even talked about.
Yeah.
Japan has an enormous supply of crude oil, is rapidly turning back on its nuclear power, and has equity positions up and down the entire LNG supply chain. And in fact, there wouldn't be an LNG supply chain were it not for Japan. And so for a country that is starved of hydrocarbons, it is doing about as good as it can do and is in as good a position as could be expected to weather this storm. And kudos to them, because they seem to have put some strategic thought into their current position. Last thing I would say about Taiwan, just briefly, is they rely on 100% of their exports. 100% on exports for their hydrocarbons. They produce basically no gas or oil, and they have precious little in the way of inventory. And China can take Taiwan tomorrow without firing a shot. We wrote a piece on this a couple of years ago called Indefensible, from memory. That was the title. And so with the U.S. moving enormous military assets to the Middle East, you can't assume that China's not looking at Taiwan and thinking it's go time. So anyway, I digress, but I'm happy to talk about Korea, Japan, or Taiwan, whichever direction you want to take it.
Well, we have probably about 5 minutes left. So maybe we should close out with some quick thoughts on markets, and in particular, we've referred to earlier, at the very beginning of the podcast about how perhaps market pricing was more optimistic than we had anticipated. You wrote about that in uh, um, lateral drilling. And I'm wondering, where do you see across the product spectrum um, the biggest concerns in terms of which products are most going to bite, and is there a specific geography or market in which they're going to bite?
Yeah, I think we've mentioned a few of them. Europe, of course, being first and foremost. China's in great shape, actually. 1.5 billion barrels. If 5 million barrels a day of the bogey goes to China, that's 300 days of supply. Um, and it has all the refining capacity it needs.
Mm.
But we've seen a lot of noise in the jet fuel market. That would be an interesting challenge. I think when you're looking for, I mean, when I hear that question, what I think you're really asking is where will demand be destroyed first?
Mhm.
I think, like we saw with COVID, air travel is a luxury that people can mostly do without. Um, is it a coincidence that DHS is unfunded and it takes 4 hours to get through security in the major airports in the US, and maybe that is a deterrent for people flying? Um, I don't know. But where you're going to see demand destroyed is in the poor countries and in the nice to haves. And it will be chaotic. Things will come out of nowhere. Um, but in hindsight, they will be obvious as these things usually are. Um, Keep an eye on Australia. We wrote, again, when you do 90 of these a year, and you're wrapping up year 5, you've probably covered a lot of things. We wrote a piece early, and I even hesitate to say the title because I'm embarrassed by the early pieces. Um, Hard to read the early pieces today. We wrote a piece called "How to Brick an Entire Economy," where we impolitely pointed out that Australia was dangerously short urea, which is the chemical name for DEF fluid, um, which you need to keep your diesel trucks on the road, which you need for your supply chains to keep running. And modern diesel trucks, because of our obsession with climate change and air quality, have these little gizmos in them that if you run out of DEF fluid, they turn the engine off. Can't start it. And so um,
It's also
where does
pretty
it?
critical to produce fertilizers, which, as a
Sure,
agriculture exporter,
sure. But DEF is a more urgent
okay.
issue. Crop yields being bad is really, just pay the clearing price for food. If you don't have urea, you can't have diesel trucks. And there's no quicker way to shut down an economy than to not have all of your diesel trucks go bricked.
Yeah.
And so these are the types of OS moments that will materialize if the strait stays closed, which unfortunately it looks like it will. If this escalation from this morning plays out the way that I personally fear that it will. So we're going to see, much like post-COVID, all kinds of wackiness. And unfortunately, well, I suppose I should feel fortunate. I'm capable of paying whatever the price of gasoline is. It's a relatively minor input into my expenses. I'm given my tiny circuit, and I could always just work from home. But for a lot of people, there's going to be a significant amount of pain, and the amount of pain you will feel is proportionate to your financial wherewithal,
Yeah.
and that's coming.
Yeah, well, look, we're gonna have to shut it down here just to exactly your point about Australia. I mean, one of the ones that puzzles me is Aussie dollar at 770 right now. Um, uh, I think a lot of people are looking at it being a large LNG exporter and ignoring exactly the product issues you were talking about. So that was kind of one of the things I was most concerned about. But I'd really like to thank you for being on the Thematic Edge podcast. You're extraordinarily generous with your time. And before we close, obviously your Substack is famous. Are there other places you'd like people to look for you, or any final thoughts you'd like to?
Sure, I could give the commercial. That'd be great. Doomberg.com is where you can find everything, and the things you can find there are our articles, our annual subscribers. We also have our pro tier, where in addition to our articles, you get a monthly pre-recorded presentation. We have about 50 of those in the archives. And then also our new Substack, Classics Read Aloud, spearheaded by one of the Doomberg co-founders and its longtime editor-in-chief. If you're looking for an escape from the news, Classics Read Aloud tab on Doomberg.com, where we curate and revive great works of literature that are kind of lost in the clickbait TikTok world that we live in today. And then all of our podcast appearances, including this one, you can find under the Doomcasts tab. We do a lot of them. I was on vacation last week. It was a bad week to be on vacation when you're in the Doom business, but I'm back and doing a fair bit of them now. So Marvin, Mark, thanks for having me on. It's been great, wonderful discussion. And may the worst case scenarios we have contemplated here not materialize.
Yes.
Exactly.
Amen.
Exactly.
Amen. Thank you both. Mark, thank you. And thanks our audience for joining us. Goodbye.